I do think it's extremely important to highlight that Mark McCandlish had been scheduled to testify before a Senate UFO UAP hearing in June 2021, with testimony that, according to colleagues, would have destroyed the "we haven't made progress" narrative. I find this extremely interesting because this is exactly the narrative we're being pushed to believe by people like Noah Elizondo, by people like Christopher Mellon, and other members of the Two Stars Academy team that arrived onto the UFO scene
Welcome
in
back. You watch
2007.
UAP Troop 33. I'm John. I'm your host. Today we're going to talk about Mark McCandlish. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Mark McCandlish, but he first came on the scene, at least when I first heard about this man, was Stephen Greer's 2001 press club event, where he presented all these whistleblowers from different walks of life, the military, defense contractors. This is when Robert Salas first kind of popped on the scene and kind of began speaking about his account with Malmstrom when the UFO disabled the 10 nuclear missiles and took them offline. Bob Jacobs, the author of UFO and Nukes, was there, and a slew of other people with, a high credibility rate. These people weren't your average UFO kooks. These were people who were deeply involved in military and defense contracts and people with impeccable reputations. And Mark McCandlish was one of those people, and he was tasked with creating these illustrations of what we would call ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles. And one of those was the Fluxliner. So we're going to talk about Mark McCandlish today and some of the things that he spoke about, and also a guy named Brad Sorensen. But you're going to want to stick with me till the end, because the way that Mark McCandlish died was very suspicious, very mysterious, and it kind of lines up with all these other people that are involved in this type of research who seem to pass under very mysterious circumstances. So stick with me. You're going to really like this show. I'll be right back. So before the whispers of secret programs, before the rumors of breakaway civilizations, technologies, there was one man whose drawings about the entire UFO research world kind of made everybody pause. And this was Mark McCandlish. And he wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He wasn't a storyteller. He had nothing to do with the SSP or the secret space program or Corey Goode or any of these people. And it was kind of strange that, at times he was getting lumped in with these people, even though he had nothing to do with them and he didn't share any of their beliefs. And I almost feel like this was a disinformation campaign to kind of discredit him, But Mark McCandlish, for decades, his work appeared in defense publications, technical manuals, and aerospace briefings. If you needed a precise engineering accurate cutaway of a classified aircraft, you called McCandlish. And in 2001, when Stephen Greer assembled military witnesses for the National Press Club Disclosure Project, McCandlish stepped forward with something no one expected, right? A detailed account of a craft he said was built in secret using technology far beyond anything the public had ever seen. But here's the part that still haunts researchers today. Just as he was preparing to speak publicly again, just as interest in his testimony was rising, and he was set to brief the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark McCandlish died under circumstances that left more questions than answers. Tonight, we're going to walk through his story, his credentials, his testimony, and the shadow that followed him. And by the end, you can decide for yourself what really happened. To understand McCandlish's testimony, you have to understand the man at the center of the story, right? A man most people have never heard of. His name was Brad Sorensen. And Sorensen wasn't a pilot. He wasn't a whistleblower engineer, but he was an engineer. A quiet, technically minded professional who had worked with several defense contractors during the 1980s. And according to McCandlish, Sorensen was invited to a classified air show at Norton Air Force Base. in November of 1988. I mean, this was not an air show for the public. It was a private demonstration for high-level aerospace insiders, the kind of people who had clearance to see things the rest of us will never get to see or know existed. Sorensen said he was escorted into a large hangar. Inside, he saw 3 craft sitting on the floor, identical, metallic, and unlike anything he had ever seen. No wings, no engines, no exhaust ports, just smooth, polished surfaces and a strange layered structure running through the center of each vehicle. He described them as hovering vehicles, gravity-defying machines capable of silent flight. And this was supposedly a quote from Sorensen. And according to Sorensen, one of the craft was powered up for the visitors. As it rose off the ground, he said the air around it shimmered, as if space itself was bending. There was no sound, no vibration, just a low electrical hum, which would kind of lend the idea that there was some serious electromagnetic, extremely high power, powering this vehicle. Some of the things that we've heard in other accounts. Sorensen said that he was allowed to look inside the cockpit, but there was no controls, no switches, no screens, nothing a pilot could physically operate. It was as if the craft wasn't meant to be flown in any conventional sense, right? Now, this was in 1988. This wasn't recent, right? You know, I feel like today in 2026, the idea of psionic assets and these mentally piloted craft, controlled UAP this is a new development. In 1988, that wasn't even thought of. Matter of fact, if you even claimed something like that, they would think you were crazy. You'd get laughed out of the room. And yet Sorensen claimed just that. When Sorensen told McCandlish what he had seen, Mark did what he always did. He treated it like an engineering problem. He began sketching, layer by layer, component by component, until the craft Sorensen described took shape on paper. The Alien Reproduction Vehicle, the ARV, also known as the Fluxliner. But here's the problem. And this is where the story becomes impossible to ignore, right? When McCandlish finished the diagram, the components weren't random, they weren't decorative, they formed a coherent system, a machine that looked like it was designed to manipulate gravity, right? And that's when another researcher stepped in, someone who wanted to test whether McCandlish's diagram was fantasy or engineering. So when Mark McCandlish finished the ARV diagram, he expected pushback, right? He expected someone to tell him this is impossible, that the components didn't make sense, that the craft couldn't function. But that's not what happened. Enter Bruce Cornet, right? Dr. Bruce Cornet wasn't a UFO researcher. He wasn't a believer. He was a scientist, a geologist, and a PhD, a former Exxon research scientist, and a man trained to look for inconsistencies. Cornet approached McCandlish's testimony the way a scientist approaches an anomaly, with skepticism and precision. And at their first meeting, when Cornet first saw the ARV diagram, he didn't dismiss it. He studied it. He traced the electrical pathways. He examined the geometry. He compared it to known electrogravitic research from the 1950s. The Tom and Townsend Brown, this sort of thing. And the deeper he looked, the more concerned he became. Because there was an engineering problem, right? Cornet realized something that most people missed. The ARV wasn't drawn like a fantasy craft. It was drawn like a machine. The central column, the rotating electric, dielectric, toroidal coil, the layered capacitor plates. These weren't decorative elements, they were functional. Cornet began to see a pattern, a system that looked engineered to manipulate mass, inertia, and gravitational fields. A system that, if real, would explain the silent hovering craft seen around the world. A system that matched eyewitness reports of UAPs decades before the Pentagon admitted they existed. But there was one detail that troubled Cornet more than anything. If this craft was built in 1988, who built it? And where did the technology come from? Cornet's analysis didn't debunk McCandlish's diagram. It didn't debunk what he drew. It did the opposite. It suggested that the ARV wasn't just plausible, it was consistent with a propulsion system decades ahead of anything in the public domain. It was what happened next, the part of the story that connects McCandlish's testimony to a pattern of secrecy that stretches far beyond Norton Air Force Base. Bruce Cornet's analysis changed everything. Because the ARV was a functional machine, and then someone somewhere had to have built it. And that raised a question bigger than McCandlish, Sorensen, or a single hangar in Norton Air Force Base. The late 1980s were a strange time in American aerospace. Billions of dollars were disappearing into classified programs. Entire aircraft were being designed, tested, and flown in total secrecy. I believe this was the time when they were, building the stealth fighter or had just finished the stealth fighter. There was a lot of secret, super deep classified research and billions of dollars being funneled into these programs. The public didn't learn about the F-117 until years later after it was operational. The B-2 was developed behind closed doors, and dozens of experimental platforms never saw the light of day. So the idea that something like the ARV could exist wasn't as impossible as it sounded. Maybe they did crack a code with this ARV. Maybe they can build these craft, but maybe they're not capable of transporting weapons or transporting large payloads. Maybe that's the catch. Maybe these craft were being used for something else. Maybe these craft were able to execute surveillance or possibly some type of psychotronic weapons. And when you look at like the ATIP Slide 9, you start to question these things. Were they, and I mean, it's clear from MK Ultra and some of the other classified programs that they were researching a lot of these strange things. Maybe these craft were a part of that research. And maybe that's why they never seen the light of day, because maybe the research is just too sensitive. But back to the story. Something else happened, something McCandlish couldn't ignore. Other witnesses began coming forward, pilots, radar operators, engineers, people who described craft with the same characteristics Sorensen had seen: silent, hovering, accelerating instantly, ignoring aerodynamic limits. Different witnesses, different locations, same behaviors. But every time McCandlish tried to verify Sorensen's story, he hit a wall. Norton Air Force Base denied any such demonstration. The Air Force denied the existence of the craft, and Sorensen himself, the man who started it all, became harder and harder to reach. McCandlish said it felt like the story was being erased in real time. But Cornet wasn't finished, because the more he studied ARV, the more he realized it matched something else, a pattern of propulsion, a signature that had been reported in UFO sightings for decades, began to appear. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. Because if the ARV was real, And if its propulsion matched the behavior of unidentified craft seen around the world, then the implications were far bigger than a single witness, a single hanger, or a single diagram. And that's when people around McCandlish began to worry. Not about the craft, but about what might happen to the man who revealed it. As Bruce Cornet dug deeper into the ARV, Mark McCandlish found himself in a position he never expected. He wasn't a whistleblower. He wasn't a spy. He was an illustrator. A man who drew what he was told. But the more he talked about the ARV, the more he realized someone didn't want that story getting out. McCandlish said strange things began happening. Phone calls that ended the moment he answered. People asking questions they shouldn't have known to ask. Friends warning him to be careful. And then there was Brad Sorensen. And you're going to see where this story kind of begins to start parallel the story of Amy Eskridge, Ning Lee, and other scientists that were involved with this type of research. You know, a lot of you guys don't know that there was like 25 scientists that were involved with Ronald Reagan's SDI research. That was Star Wars back in the 80s. And 25 of those scientists died under very mysterious circumstances. Crazy, unexplained unalivings. Some of them classified as self-unalivings, but they were like really gruesome and hard to imagine somebody could have done some of the things that they were supposed to have done to themselves. And you see a lot of those types of things leaking into this investigation. And this one was disturbing too. Not quite as disturbing as Amy Eskridge, but disturbing. So here we go. The man who had seen the craft, the man who started the entire story, became harder and harder to reach. And this was Brad Sorensen, right? McCandlish said Sorensen stopped returning calls, stopped answering letters, stopped acknowledging the event at Norton altogether. He was like ghosting him. It was as if the witness had been swallowed by the system he had accidentally exposed. Then there was the Disclosure Project. In 2001, McCandlish stepped onto the national stage. Dr. Stephen Greer had assembled military personnel, pilots, intelligence officers, all ready to testify under oath. McCandlish presented the ARV diagram. He described Sorensen's account, and he laid out the engineering. But behind the scenes, he was worried. McCandlish told friends he felt watched. He said he was worried, quietly, indirectly, that he was getting too close to something he wasn't supposed to understand. He wasn't dramatic about it. He wasn't paranoid. He was careful. He knew about classified programs to recognize when a line had been crossed. And I believe he felt like he crossed that line. In the years that followed, McCandlish continued to speak, but cautiously. He focused on the engineering. He avoided speculation. He stayed grounded. But the pressure never went away. And the thing is, like, he got lumped in somehow with this SSP, secret space program, the whole, Corey Good type group, and, these types of outlandish claims by these very sorry individuals. But he wasn't that. He wasn't making claims like that. He was all about the technology, the drawings, what Sorensen had revealed to him. But you're going to want to stay tuned for this next scene, because this is the part of the story that no one can explain. By 2021, Mark McCandlish had spent more than 3 decades talking about the ARV, carefully, cautiously, and always with the same consistency. He wasn't trying to be famous. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply trying to tell the truth as he understood it. And then something changed. McCandlish had agreed to speak again, a new presentation, a deeper breakdown of the ARV, and a set of details he had never shared publicly before. Friends said that he was energized, focused, ready. And then just days before the event, he was gone. The official ruling was a self-unaliving. I can't say the actual word because of YouTube, but you know what I'm talking about. And it was a self-inflicted shotgun wound, apparently to the head. But the timing, the circumstances, and the suddenness of it all left many who knew him struggling to understand what had happened. And there's a lot of unanswered questions, man. McCandlish had never expressed despair. He never hinted of a personal crisis. He never suggested he was in danger. I mean, he was worried about his what he had exposed. So he was a little uneasy about his safety and these things. In fact, but he was preparing to speak, and he was preparing to reveal new information, preparing to step back into the public eye. People say that he was getting ready to testify in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. This was just after the 2017 New York Times article that was kind of revealing the Pentagon's UAP program, ATIP, OSAP. But then without warning, before he could do any of these things, he was gone. And the people who were close to him described the news as shocking, totally out of character. Some believed the pressure had finally taken its toll, but others believed the timing was too precise to ignore. But no one had answers. What happened to Mark McCandlish in those final days remains one of the most unsettling parts of this story. And when you look at what he was preparing to reveal, the questions only grow darker. And this is where kind of, you got Mark McCandlish, Amy Eskridge, Dr. Ning Lee. And if you look into the SDI scientists of the 80s, what the hell is going on with these researchers that are revealing these secrets about anti-gravity, ARVs, this technology? The fact that we've been pursuing this technology for decades and decades and decades. Mark McCandlish never asked to be the center of a mystery. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a government insider. He wasn't even a whistleblower. He was an illustrator, a man who drew what others built. But the thread he pulled, look, when he put pencil to paper and reconstructed the craft Brad Sorensen described, he pulled a thread that led into the deeper shadows of American aerospace, a thread that connected classified hangars, black budget programs, and a propulsion system that shouldn't exist. McCandlish didn't claim to know everything. He didn't claim to have the answers, but he knew enough to ask the right questions. Why did Sorensen disappear on him? Why did the Air Force deny the demonstration? Why did the ARV's engineering match decades of UAP behavior and other anti-gravitic research? And why, just days before he was scheduled to speak again, did Mark McCandlish die? The official story says one thing. The timing suggests another. And the truth remains somewhere in between. We may never know. But what we're left with is a man who tried to share what he believed was real, a man who stayed consistent for more than 30 years, a man whose testimony never wavered, and a craft, the ARV, which still defies explanation. Maybe McCandlish was right, maybe he was wrong, but the questions he raised, the patterns he revealed, and the silence that followed him, those things are real. And when someone answers those questions, and until someone answers those questions, Mark McCandlish's story isn't over. So if you like this episode, please hit the like, subscribe, share it to a friend, share it to 2 friends. This one was another tough one. Definitely not as difficult as Amy Eskridge, but this one kind of hit home, you know. Here's this guy. He worked for defense contractors. His job was to illustrate these prototypes, you know, for the military. He gets told a story by a friend, Brad Sorensen, who was also involved deeply with the military and these types of programs and these defense contractors and aerospace programs. And McCandlish tries to convey this story. He actually draws a blueprint of the ARV. Somebody who has a scientific framework, you know, expertise and background, looks at it, says, hey, this is real, right? This matches up with the anti-gravity research from the 50s. Then Mark McCandlish gets slated to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee, which, if you think about it, would fly in the face of this, hey, we don't know what these things are, we've never seen this, you know, we don't have this technology. And now you start hearing things like the Tic Tac from the 2004 Nimitz incident was Lockheed Skunk Works, right? Mark McCandlish was getting ready to expose that maybe we did have this technology, and maybe, who knows, maybe some of these abductions aren't just otherworldly, but might have a more earthly source. But it makes you ask, what's the purpose of this, right? What's the purpose of this? If we did have the technology, why keep it secret? I think that part is not as mysterious as Mark McCandlish's death, but I think we should remember him for what he did, what he tried to do, the thread that he pulled. And I'm going to leave a little clip in here, Project Unity with Jay, and what he said whenever he interviewed, or somebody from his team interviewed Brad Sorensen, what Brad Sorensen said about Mark McCandlish. And I think you're going to think that after hearing that, this whole self-unaliving with a shotgun, I don't believe it.
I do think it's extremely important to highlight that Mark McCandlish had been scheduled to testify before a Senate UFO UAP hearing in June 2021, with testimony that, according to colleagues, would have destroyed the "we haven't made progress" narrative. I find this extremely interesting because this is exactly the narrative we're being pushed to believe by people like Lou Elizondo, by people like Christopher Mellon, and other members of the To The Stars Academy team that arrived onto the UFO scene in 2017. They've consistently pushed a narrative that none of these UFOs represent human-made technology, that none of this is possible for us to achieve ourselves. We have no idea who is piloting these UFOs or how they work. And this narrative completely contradicts Mark McCandlish's story. So his testimony at an official Senate hearing, his testimony being put into the record, that would have been a problem. It would have been a problem, and that problem was solved by his death, whether intentional or not. That's all I'm going to say. James Allen's death in December 2013, occurring shortly after completing his 0 Point documentary, was another extremely suspicious moment in the ARV Fluxliner story. For a university project, did a film on the ARV Fluxliner. Mark McCandlish, Brad Sorensen, he was investigating this whole issue, and his death occurred within months of his movie, his film documentary coming out, the ARV Fluxliner zero-point documentary. The death occurred under very unusual circumstances. It was a rare, extremely aggressive cancer diagnosis, approximately 2.5 months before death, with rapid deterioration despite treatment. And this is where it gets really quite unsettling. Toxicology reports post-mortem revealed heavy metal and radioisotope contamination, specifically thorium and uranium, in Alan's body at the time of death. The source and the timing of this contamination remains unknown and unexplained. Some researchers propose that Alan's death represented institutional retaliation for the documentary's completion and planned distribution, similar to suspected circumstances surrounding McCandlish's death. The presence of radioactive materials in a filmmaker's body, absent any legitimate occupational exposure history, and off of the back of doing an expose on something extremely classified in the black budget aerospace world, I mean, the heightened suspicion of deliberate poisoning, I think, is very well justified. So I'm now because Brad had a lot to say about not only Mark McCandlish, but about his own aerospace capabilities. At the end of the day, you have to decide for yourself if you believe what Brad is saying, but this is what Brad said to us on the phone about 2.5 years ago, and this is the first time that I'm actually speaking about this publicly. The following statements are from Brad Sorensen. I'm working on things I started working on at Area 51. So these people know me, okay? They know where I live. They would just fucking fry me. They would fry me. So we are designing an aircraft that goes 210 times the speed of light. 210 times the speed of light. So here's the cool thing. If we wanted to visit an exoplanet that is spinning around Alpha Centauri, which is one of our closest stars, it would take roughly 6 days to get there. And then we can do research and we can look at what's on the oceans and we can check out the planets, and then we can come back and we'd be back within a month. That is priceless. We human beings have to realize that we're not alone in this universe. And if we screw up this planet that has an atmosphere around it that in proportion is thinner than the shell of an egg, if we screw up that atmosphere, we're gone. We're dead. We have no more future. So I signed an agreement with the government that I would keep their secrets for 30 years, and I've gone past that. And they wanted me to re-up, and I said absolutely not. I'm a free man. I'm an American. Now, Brad was then asked a question about Mark McCandlish. He was asked, was Mark McCandlish accurate in his portrayal of your story, or was it conflated? Brad Sorensen's response, that's classified. I can't say whether it is or isn't. It's classified. But I've also told you that I'm capable of designing and building a ship that will go 210 times the speed of light. Does that give you an idea? The people who I work for, the people who are fabulous to me, okay? And the people who are going to fix this beautiful planet, they don't want people to know what they're up to. Why would they? Why would they? Because I can trust an individual, but I can't trust a herd. Mark McCandlish could have had it all. I was trying to hand him the key to the universe, literally. Because I was so busy back in 1986 that I didn't have time, and he's a very good painter, so I thought, wouldn't it be great to hire him to do some paintings and illustrations of these new superluminal craft? And I invited him to join me, and he paid me back by telling the world about it. Even though I told him time and time again, you've got to keep this secret if you want to work for me, okay? He was a bombastic fucking idiot. He was absolutely into himself only, and he was a, how can I put this? Narcissistic, I don't know, you know, just look at me, look at me, look at me kind of a guy, okay? Well, he blew it, because he could have worked with me on these craft, which, by the way, were built all up. We've been to every piece of rock in this solar system, and what we found is that we must make the Earth work. Now, those are the verbatim notes that I took from hearing this conversation with Brad Sorensen. It's up to you, like I said, to decide for yourself whether or not you trust his position and his testimony. He claimed
it just matches too much with this pattern. People in this trying to expose this field of research. These people keep coming up dead. That's crazy. But please share it to a friend, share it to 2 friends. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.